Empty shelves, $12 vegetables. Tomato starts collapsing in a week of heat. Soil that looks dark on top. Then turns to brick. A second. The sun hits it. And every time a backyard garden fails, the blame lands on you. Wrong seed. Wrong timing. Not enough effort. Not enough skill. But look closer at the pattern. You didn't just lose a plant. You were dropped into a system designed to fail expensively, then trained to think the failure was personal. Because the moment the insects arrive, the script is already written for you. Buy the spray, buy the dust. That is the trap, not laziness, not ignorance. And the body knows this before the mind admits it. You walk outside and see lace-eaten kale, holes in the bean leaves. Modern agriculture calls this progress. But progress shouldn't leave you with sterile dirt, rising costs, weaker seed, fewer pollinators, and a permanent sense of emergency. By the time most people notice something is wrong, they're already paying for it. The leaves curl, the pests arrive, the soil hardens, the harvest shrinks. This didn't begin with your backyard. It began when agriculture made a bargain with poison and dressed it up as science. In the industrial age, they were boiling copper and arsenic in factories to make Paris green, then dusting food crops with it, as if the field were a battlefield and the crop itself were expendable collateral. Potatoes were saved by contaminating the ground that had to feed the next season. Because if you can convince a grower that life in the soil is the enemy, then every destructive practice starts to look reasonable. Deep tillage starts to look clean, but every pass of the blade is a wrecking ball through a living city. Fungal threads torn apart, moisture channels collapse, and chemical fertilizer always arrives wearing a hero's mask. Fast green growth, quick recovery, but that flush is not proof of health. It is a sugar rush for a plant, standing in a collapsing ecosystem. Then the second invoice arrives. Weak plants attract pressure, so now you need the spray. Insecticide for the chewers, fungicide for the mildew, herbicide for the competition. Each one advertised as a precise intervention. But in the ground, nothing is isolated. The fungicide doesn't know the difference between a pathogen and the fungi. That builds soil structure, fairy phosphorus, and help roots survive drought. Even the products sold as wholesome replacements often carry the same logic. Enriched potting soil, complete nutrition, sterile planting mix. Read the bag closely, and you find dead material, salt-based feed, maybe a wetting agent, maybe a synthetic charge, to make seedlings look good on a shelf for 2 weeks. It performs like makeup, dark color on top, nice texture at first touch. Then one stretch of heat, and it turns hydrophobic, dusty, inert. And the cruelest part is how this system rewrites your emotions. You blame yourself for the tomato that collapses in July. You think you underwatered, overwatered, fed too early. Older growers understood something the chemical age dismissed as primitive. Because it was too cheap to patent, they didn't begin by sterilizing the battlefield. They paid attention to what the land already knew how to do. In some places, while the modern world escalated from dusts to sprays to synthetic repellents, other people kept using wood, sap, timing, distance, placement, and eventually the laboratories, after a century of sneering at what they hadn't bothered to measure, started finding pieces of the mechanism. Certain woods weren't symbols, they were chemistry, dense defensive oils, locked inside the heartwood. That is the fracture line. On one side, an agricultural model that kills the biology, sells the rescue, and calls the dependence normal. On the other, a buried set of methods that work with plant chemistry, soil life, and behavior instead of against them. Once you see that line, a lot of your frustration changes shape, because the real story wasn't above ground, not the leaves, not the insects turning away. The bigger story was happening in the dark, in the cold layer beneath your boots, where almost nobody looks. Scientists cut trenches into the soil in Ohio expecting the usual aftermath of pest control, compacted dirt, dead zones, a silent microbiome. That is what chemical defense usually leaves behind, a clean-looking surface. Picture a handful of healthy soil, broken apart on a table. It is not just dirt, it is architecture, tiny crumbs glued together by bacteria. Fine, white, fungal strands stretched between them like fishing line, moisture held in little pockets. Root hairs reaching into that maze like fingers searching through fabric. Now picture a cut branch slowly leaking its compounds into that same space. Not as a blast, not as a poison dump, but as a steady seep. That was the shock around the wood. Mycorrhizal fungi didn't decline. They surged, not by a little, by hundreds of %. And that matters because fungi aren't decoration in a garden. They're logistics. They extend the reach of roots, the way fiber optic cable extends the reach of a city. A tomato root can only touch what is inches away. A fungal network can range far beyond that, slipping through pores too small for roots, pulling in water, phosphorus, trace minerals, then trading them back to the plant. Sugar goes one direction, nutrients come the other way. No mystery, no magic, just exchange. This is the law we forgot. Plants don't grow alone, they grow inside alliances. When that alliance is intact, you see the effects above ground, long before you understand the mechanics below. Stems thicken, leaves stay firmer through heat. Squash roots drive deeper, instead of hovering near the dry surface. A bed that should wilt by late afternoon holds on until evening. Same sun, same rain, different underground economy. That is why two gardens on the same street can live in different realities. One is just plants, in dirt. The other is roots plugged into a functioning network. And wood changes more than biology. It changes climate at the scale that matters to a seedling. Not the climate on the weather app. The climate 6 inches above the soil, 1 inch below the mulch. Under the leaves, beside the stem. That tiny zone decides whether moisture stays or vanishes, whether a beneficial fungus survives noon heat, whether a young transplant spends energy growing or merely surviving. A stake, a hedge, a rough branch line, even a low barrier of thorny cuttings can slow wind, soften temperature swings, trap humidity, and create a pocket where life compounds instead of leaking away. The old growers didn't need to say microclimate. They just watched which beds stayed lush. Modern people hear that and think superstition. We've been trained to trust only what comes in a labeled container. But there is nothing mystical about a cooler patch of soil staying damp longer. Nothing mystical about fungal threads expanding where the chemistry favors them. Nothing mystical about roots gaining a second reach through symbiosis. If you've ever lifted mulch after a hot day and found dark, cool earth underneath, while exposed ground nearby was pale and dusty, you've already seen the principle. Nature is always running these quiet calculations, and once you see it, a lot of failures start to make sense. The backyard that needs constant watering, the vegetables that look hungry no matter what you feed them, the pest pressure that gets worse every year, the bed that turns to crust after one dry week. People blame themselves. They blame bad luck. They buy another bottle. But many of those gardens aren't losing because the owner is lazy or ignorant. They're losing because the invisible workforce was stripped out and the shelter was flattened. The soil was reduced to a feeding medium instead of a living system. The old branch in the ground was never just a repellent. It was a trigger, a boundary above, a stimulant below, a physical object doing chemical, biological, and climatic work all at once. That is why these older methods look too simple to be real. We've been taught to expect one product for one problem. Fungicide for fungus, insecticide for insects, fertilizer for growth, wetting agent for dryness, shade cloth for heat, soil inoculant for microbial life. The land doesn't work that way. The land stacks functions. A single object can redirect insects, feed fungi, and buffer moisture, and gradually return carbon to the ground as it ages. That isn't primitive, that is efficient. So the forgotten code isn't to use magic wood. The forgotten code is much bigger. Build conditions, and life starts doing the labor for free. That is what industrial agriculture could never comfortably sell. Not because it was false, because it was cheap, because it was local. The part most people miss is how little force nature actually needs. Not more products, not more labor. Look closely at what Silas is really doing, because it doesn't look like modern farming at all. He isn't chasing pests after they arrive. He isn't waiting for damage and then reacting with a bottle. He changes the conditions first, before the leaves are chewed, before the stems are scarred, before the panic purchase at the feed store. He walks the edge of the garden and sets those cured Osage stakes 12 feet apart, one after another, like quiet punctuation marks in the soil, with absolutely no engine noise. And that is the part that sounds too small to matter. People have been trained to believe solutions must look expensive to be real. If it doesn't come in a branded jug, if it doesn't burn the nose, if it doesn't require gloves and a barcode and a receipt, then surely it cannot protect a crop. But ecological systems don't respond to price tags. They respond to signals, to scent, to moisture, to shade, to shelter, to edges, to fungi, to barriers that aren't walls in the human sense, but messages in the language of living things. That is why the most powerful move is often subtraction. Disturb less, expose less, kill less. Let the ground stay covered. Let the air near the soil stay damp. Let decaying material feed the underground workers you can't see. Lay down plain brown cardboard where weeds keep winning. Not glossy boxes with heavy ink. Just simple cardboard, soaked by rain, pinned by mulch. It blocks the light, holds moisture, and softens into the earth. And suddenly the frantic cycle of hoeing and regrowth begins to break. You didn't conquer the weeds, you change the terms. The same with fallen leaves and kitchen scraps. Most people bag them, haul them, dump them, treat them like waste. And then they go buy fertilizer. That is the trap in one image. Throwing away fertility with one hand, purchasing it back with the other. But pile those leaves around the base of your crops. Bury the peels, the stems, the coffee grounds under cover, where the sun cannot bake them dry. Let worms find them. Let fungi thread through them. Let that slow, dark conversion happen without your supervision. Less cleanup, more life, less management, more soil. Or take the most ignored material in a yard. Dead wood. A rotting log, a stack of pruned branches, twisted limbs from a storm. Modern instinct says remove it. Chip it, burn it, make the place look tidy. But buried wood is a reservoir. It drinks in rain when the weather is wet, and leaks it back when the weather turns cruel. It becomes a sponge below the roots, a shelter below the heat, a feeding zone below the reach of summer wind. You dig a shallow trench, drop in rough wood, cover it with soil and whatever organic matter you have, and then you stop fussing. The bed settles, fungi move in, moisture lingers longer. The plants above it stop behaving like orphans. Again, the strange result arrives from the modest act. This is the pattern. The system begins to work when you stop interrupting every process that would have worked for free. Bare soil was never a natural condition. Constant tillage was never a neutral act. Every pass of steel tears fungal networks, dumps stored moisture into the air, wakes dormant weed seeds, and tells the land to start over from zero. Then we stare at the exhaustion we created and call the soil weak. But give that same patch of ground cover, carbon, roots, and time, and it starts rebuilding itself under your feet. Darker, softer, looser, quieter. You can smell the difference before you can measure it. That smell matters. Anyone who has handled living soil knows it. Not the sour stink of runoff, not the sterile dust of dead ground. The smell, after rain, in a rich garden bed. Deep, sweet, almost fungal, almost forest. That isn't romance. That is biology returning to function. That is a workforce underground doing its jobs, without wages, without diesel, without invoices. Aggregates forming, water infiltrating, minerals cycling, predators balancing prey, roots bargaining with microbes in the dark. And once you understand that, the whole economic picture flips upside down. The question stops being, what do I need to buy to make this land produce? The better question is, what am I doing that keeps the land from producing on its own? Sometimes, the answer is painfully ordinary. You're raking away mulch. You're leaving the soil naked. You're tilling because the culture told you clean lines mean competence. You're spending money to replace functions that leaves, wood, and shade provide. Functions that compost and patience were ready to provide. That is why these old methods survive in plain sight. They look too humble to threaten an industry until you notice what they eliminate. Fewer sprays, fewer inputs, fewer emergency fixes, fewer dependency loops. A stake instead of a treatment plan, cardboard instead of herbicide, fallen leaves instead of purchased feed, rotten wood instead of daily irrigation panic. The less glamorous the object, the more dangerous the lesson. Because the lesson is this: if the system is designed well, your job gets smaller. And people resist that idea. They almost have to. It overturns the whole performance of modern control. It suggests that competence may look less like domination and more like placement. Put the right thing in the right place, at the right time, then leave it alone long enough to do what it has always done. The hardest part isn't the labor. The hardest part is trusting that you don't need to interfere every hour. So when a visitor leans over a fence and asks, what product made those tomatoes so clean? The real answer sounds absurdly cheap. Wood, scrap, rot time, the materials of neglect rearranged into a living design. That is the hidden leverage. Not doing nothing, doing the one small thing that lets everything else start. What is the simplest lazy garden trick you've ever seen actually outperform the expensive one? Here is the part that matters when the lights flicker and the trucks stop and the store shelves turn into bare metal in a single afternoon. In that moment, nobody cares about branding. Nobody cares about clever packaging. Nobody cares which spray had the nicest label. What matters is brutally simple. Can you walk a few steps from your own door and bring back real food in your hands? That is why this never was about a cute garden hack. It was never about weekend hobby culture. It was never about playing farmer for social media. A stake of raw wood in the soil, a bed that protects itself, a system that asks less from you and gives more back. This is a different kind of wealth. Quiet wealth, the kind you cannot panic buy. The kind no app can deliver when the chain breaks. Most people have been trained to think food comes from a scanner, a receipt, a refrigerated truck, a warehouse they will never see. They think security is a full parking lot and bright fluorescent aisles. Until one storm hits, one shortage, one price spike, one contamination recall. Then the illusion collapses all at once. The tomato becomes $6. The lettuce looks tired. The eggs are rationed. People stand under buzzing lights with carts, full of fear, grabbing whatever is left. And somewhere else, in a backyard, with mulch on the ground, and wood in the soil, someone opens a gate, kneels down, brushes dirt from a carrot, cuts greens for dinner, and goes back inside. That is the divide. On one side dependence, on the other memory. On one side, you're forced to accept whatever the system offers you this week, at whatever price, under whatever chemical regime, after however many hands have touched it. On the other, you know your ground, you know what went into it, you know what did not, you know why the leaves are intact, you know why the worms are still in the soil, you know why the bees still visit, you know the food is not just edible, it is yours. And ownership changes a person, not legal ownership on paper. Deeper than that, physical ownership, sensory ownership. You smell the earth after rain, you feel the cool boards of a cellar shelf, you hear jars touch in the dark. You pull onions from a crate, garlic from a braid, potatoes from a bin of dust and straw. You slice into a squash. You cured yourself months earlier. Outside, people are refreshing news feeds, watching prices jump by the hour. Inside, dinner is already waiting. That is food, sovereignty, in its most human form. Not ideology, not a slogan, not a flag. The ability to feed yourself without asking permission from a brittle machine. Because a brittle machine is exactly what we built. It looks enormous, but it fails in tiny ways first. Fertilizer cost, fuel cost, transport delay, labor shortage, crop disease, water restriction, packaging shortage, data outage, payment glitch. Then suddenly the giant thing everybody trusted begins coughing in public. And when it does, the people who only know consumption become terrified. The people who know production become calm. Calm is a power, a bed of vegetables that can defend itself. With simple materials, it is not just saving you money. It is teaching you not to beg. It is teaching your body a different reflex. Instead of rushing outward in panic, you move inward with confidence. To the yard, to the pantry, to the shed, to the cellar, to the place where your life is still under your control. That is why the old knowledge matters. Not because it is quaint, because it is durable, because it survives fashion, because it survives marketing, because it doesn't need a barcode to be real. A cut branch, dark soil, seasonal timing, patience. Replacement when the wood is spent, then back into compost, back into earth, nothing wasted, nothing theatrical. Just a living agreement between you and the land. If I stop fighting you, if I stop poisoning you, if I learn your patterns instead of imposing mine, you will feed me. And the land answers yes, not perfectly, not magically, but faithfully. Enough to change the balance, enough to turn fear into preparation, enough to make a household less vulnerable than it was last year. That is how dignity returns, not in one grand gesture. Call it what it is, taking back the oldest power a household ever had. If everything around you became harder tomorrow, would your first instinct be to drive to the store or walk to your soil?